In this segment, we're going to talk about dividing fractions, in dividing proper fractions by proper fractions, and dividing improper fractions or mixed fractions by proper fractions. Again, just reviewing the critical understandings that are necessary for students to understand what's going on with the pictures and with division of fractions. If I divide a number by 1, it doesn't change the number. That one's pretty straightforward. The last one here, dividing any number by a number greater than 1 makes the answer less. That's the one that most people are familiar with. So 10 divided by 5 is 2. So my 2 is less than my starting number of 10. And this is the one here that we're working with, and that's the one that causes the most confusion. Dividing a number by a number less than 1. Since I'm dividing it into smaller pieces, how many little tiny pieces are there in a big piece? I would expect to have more of them. So when I'm dividing by a number less than 1, my answer should be greater than what I started with. So here's my first question, 1/4 divided by 1/3. Just thinking about it logically, if I'm dividing by a number smaller than 1, I should be getting an answer bigger than my starting number, so I should be getting the answer bigger than 1/4. Now if I was dividing by 1/4, I would expect the answer to be 1. 1/4 divided by 1/4 is 1. 1/3 is larger than 1/4, so what should I expect? Should I expect my answer to be bigger than 1/4, bigger than 1, or smaller than 1? And since I'm dividing by something bigger than what I'm starting with, I would expect my answer to be a little bit smaller than 1. So I know it's going to be bigger than 1/4 because I'm dividing by a number less than 1. And I'm also dividing by a number smaller than what bigger than what I'm starting with. So I would expect to get my answer smaller than 1 whole. So I know my answer is going to be somewhere between 1/4 and 1 whole. So I'm starting off. I know I need quarters and thirds, so I'm dividing it up into quarters and thirds. So I first shade in my starting number, which is 1/4, and now I want to find out how many thirds are in that 1/4. So now I'm going to move horizontally. So here's my question. 1/4, which is my yellow, divided by 1/3, which is my big blue section here. How many 1/3s are there in 1/4? Or how many 1/3s can I make out of a quarter of a piece? So how many blues can I make out of this piece of yellow? Well, I can see I can make this piece out of a piece of yellow, and I've got another piece here and another piece here that I can maybe move up and take a look. So I'm going to subdivide this yellow up into a few more pieces and then see what happens. So here's my yellow. I subdivided it up into 2 more pieces. And so now I can take these pieces and I can slide them up into here. And remember what my question's asking. How many blues can I make out of this yellow 1/4 strip? How many pieces that are this wide can I make out of this piece of yellow that goes from here all the way down to here? So I can fill up this one here. I can fill up this one, and I can fill up this one. But I don't have enough yellow to fill up all the way over for even 1 whole row. So I don't have enough to make 1 whole third. But I do have enough to make 1, 2, 3 out of 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces. So I could say my answer is 3/4. Remembering my answer is always talking about how far from here to here I'm doing. My answer is always on the top of my question. So I have enough yellow that I can subdivide up into 3 pieces, move them into here, here, and here, and that's enough to make 3/4 of one of my blue pieces. So my answer to this question is 3/4. Here's our next question. 3/4 divided by 1/2. How many halves are in 3/4? I'm dividing by a number smaller than 1. And so I expect to get an answer bigger than what I started with. I'm also dividing by a number smaller than what I'm starting with, so I expect my answer to be bigger than 1. If I was going 3/4 divided by 3/4, I would get 1. Since I'm dividing by something smaller, I would expect to get more than 1. So I know my answer is going to be greater than 3/4, and I also know it's going to be greater than 1. Let's take a look at what my picture might look like. So I start off with my 3/4 being shaded in. That's my first number, so I shade it in vertically. I always start my first number off vertically. So I've got my 3/4 shaded in, and now I want to find out how many halves can I make out of that. So I'm going to shade in my 1/2. So now I can see, and I ask myself, do I have enough yellows to fill up one of my blues? Because my question is, how many halves are in 3/4? Or, if I have my 3/4, how many halves can I make? So I'm just going to recolor these just so that we can see our pieces a little clearer. And I can see that I have 1, 2, 3 filled in with my yellows, but this piece isn't filled in. So I'm going to fill that in with that piece. So now I have one whole set of 3/4. Pardon me, one whole set of a half. And now I have to take a look and see I've got these pieces left over as well. So now I can move this over to the other side. And so what do I have now? I now have enough to say that I have one whole half plus this much. Well, how much is 2 sections worth? Well, 2 sections of my 4 sections would be a half. So I've got one whole and 1/2. So therefore my answer, 3/4 divided by a half, is equal to 1 and 1/2, which is what we said we were expecting. We expected an answer bigger than 3/4 and an answer a little bit big and an answer bigger than 1. And that's what we got, an answer 1 and 1/2. 1 and 1/2 what? 1 and 1/2 halves. How many halves are in 3/4? A full half plus half of a half. 1 1/2 halves. So our answer is 1 and 1/2. We can also say 1 and 1/2 is 3 halves. How does our diagram show 3 halves? Remember, we're talking about our distance going in this direction. So in this direction, from here to here is one whole. So from here to here is 1/2. From here to here is another half. From here to here is another half. So we've got 1, 2, 3 halves. So I can get my answer showing as 3 halves as well. We might also want to take a moment here to point out something that a lot of people don't understand, especially people who have been taught multiplying by the reciprocal their entire lives, that there is another way of doing the division. And here I'm going to put it right down here. We could go 3/4 divided by 1/2. 3 divided by 1 is 3. And 4 divided by 2 is 2. And so again, my answer comes out to 3 halves. Now, this doesn't always work because sometimes we don't get nice answers. But if I can go top divided by top and bottom divided by bottom, and I get whole numbers nicely, why not do that? I get the exact same answer as I do if I go multiplication. Top times top, bottom times bottom. So this is a viable option that we can do. It doesn't always work depending on certain numbers. But it is one technique that students could be able to use, and it's quite fast and quite painless. Our next example is going to be working with a mixed fraction now. 1 and 1/2 divided by 1/2. So the question is, how many halves are in 1 and 1/2? Or if I had 1 and 1/2, how many halves could I make? And if we think about it a little bit, it takes 2 halves to make a whole, so probably 3 should be my answer. If I'm thinking about it again, I could say I'm dividing by a number smaller than 1, so therefore I should get an answer bigger than what I started with. And I'm also dividing by a number smaller than what I'm starting with, so I should get an answer bigger than what I'm starting with. So I know I'm going to get an answer bigger than 1 and 1/2. So here we have our 1 whole plus our 1/2. And again, our first number is always filled down vertically. So here's 1 and 1/2. And we want to figure out how many halves. So we have to go horizontally now. And here's our half in the blue. It goes across there. So my question is, how many blue sections can I make out of all this yellow? How many halves are in 1 and 1/2? 1 and 1/2 can make how many halves? All of these are ways of talking and thinking about this. So I'm talking about halves, so I'm going to draw my line here to make halves and subdivide it up a little bit more. So I take a look and I see this piece here is 1 full half. From here to here is 1 whole, because that's my square, 1 by 1. So I've got 1 full half. I've got a piece of 1 here, which would be a half of 1. And then I could take this piece here, and if I move this piece up to here, Now that fills it in, and I have a full, there's another half, so I've got another whole 1. And then this piece down here in the corner is missing. If I slide that up there now, I can do that. So now, here's my half that I'm looking for. How many halves, how many of this height can I make out of all this yellow? I can make this piece all in here. That's one whole. These two together make another whole. And this piece down here now is up here. That's another whole. So I've got 1, 2, 3. So my answer to this question is 3. How many halves are in 1 1/2? There are 3 halves in. Now if I want to change this to the improper fraction technique, I can do that. I'll rewrite the question. And there's the question is there. 3 halves divided by 1/2, or how many 1/2s are in 3 halves? Well, that makes sense. If they're both halves, how many 1s are in 3? Well, 3 of them. So my answer would be 3. I could also go 3 divided by 1 is 1, and 3 divided by 1 is 3, and 2 divided by 2 is 1. So I get my answer of 3 over 1, or 3 yet again. So all of our examples so far have been dividing by a proper fraction, always dividing by something less than 1 whole. And so what we've been doing for all of our questions have been moving pieces up to fill up the piece that we started off with. When we start dividing by fractions greater than 1, then we're going to have to be moving things in the other direction, and that makes sense. So we've been dividing by things smaller than 1, so we've been expecting to get our answers are longer, are bigger. Because we're dividing by numbers less than 1, our answers have to grow. When we start dividing by numbers larger than 1, our answers, which are found on top, are going to have to shrink. And that's what we're going to do in the next segment.